A translation relay is a sort of game where you take a short passage, a quote or poem or short story, and translate it from language to language to language like a game of telephone to see what you get out at the other end. It's especially popular in the conlang community, where it's usually just called a conlang relay. There was a relay hosted on YouTube a few months ago, and I'm participating in a relay myself for the upcoming Language Creation Conference. But I wanted to do something a bit bigger in this video. The fun thing about relays is that, just like in a game of telephone, the meaning of the message tends to distort over time. Meanings will be changed and nuances lost, both because no translation is exact, and because people don't perfectly understand the other language, especially for conlangs. But conlang relays tend to be limited in size, 10, 20, maybe 30 steps. After seeing relays in the past, I wondered what would happen if you kept a relay going through hundreds of steps. Would the message dissolve into nonsense as the noise overwhelmed the signal? Would the inexact translations lose words one by one until the message was whittled down to nothing? Or would it expand as inexact translations added words? I don't speak hundreds of languages to try to translate something that far, and I don't know enough people who all speak different languages either. But in today's modern world, there is an alternative: Google Translate. I originally wanted to use Python to automate this process, but that fell through pretty badly. The best Google Translate API I could find for Python was so outdated that it only had a third of the current language list, and the translations weren't nearly as good without the current AI algorithms, so I had to do it manually. And I didn't hold back. I translated The North Wind and the Sun from Aesop's Fables through every single language on Google Translate. Well, almost. I skipped a few because they didn't add anything meaningful. I skipped Esperanto because it's the sole constructed language in Google Translate. It didn't feel appropriate to include it in a NatLang relay. I also skipped cases where there were multiple dialects of the same language, like French versus Canadian French, or if they were the same language written in multiple scripts, like traditional versus simplified Chinese. The final tally was 233 out of 249 listed languages. But there's another complication. As far as we know, Google Translate does not actually translate language to language arbitrarily. In most cases, it seems to translate to English and then to another language. Google hasn't come out and said this directly that I've seen, but native speakers have done translation experiments and determined that that's what they must be doing. This, of course, introduces an additional layer of biases and errors, but it's a compromise they have to make, since for any-to-any translation, the problem is effectively squared, and because there are fewer any-to-any dictionaries out there as opposed to any-to-English. I wasn't worried about this because this is how conlang relays also work. Conlangers rarely speak each other's languages, so relays also translate conlang to English to conlang. Although there are some translations in Google that don't work that way. A few languages appear to have an extra step where they're translated to another similar language and then to English. For example, Ukrainian appears to be translated to Russian and then to English. Most such pairs are very similar languages, but there's one exception to that rule, in that the people who've looked at it say that Korean is translated through Japanese and then to English, even though Japanese is both a language isolate and notoriously difficult to translate itself. But the reason is simple. There's a much larger corpus of Korean to Japanese translations out there than Korean to English. Since I didn't know exactly what translations are done how, I didn't worry about that. Plus, I translated through English at every step regardless in order to see how the passage was changing. And it looked like this. I kept the 5-line structure from the original passage. Google Translate preserved sentence breaks and line breaks, so it continued to handle each line separately all the way through. I highlighted words at each step for various reasons, whether they changed or stayed the same when other instances of them changed, or were lost or gained or rearranged. I won't promise they're correct all the way through, And after a while I stopped highlighting some of the common ones that only flipped back and forth between two options. But it should illustrate most of the times that the meaning of the passage changed. And some of the different words aren't that important, but some of them are more unusual. One thing you notice pretty quickly is that the grammar can drift around a lot. You might get different verb tenses and different pronouns out at each iteration. Usually that doesn't matter, but sometimes it results in the sentence being rearranged. For example, the traveler's cloak starts taking active verb forms, and then the cloak attacks the north wind. Later, the cloak somehow changes to a hat, and then the north wind becomes the east wind. And this is something I noticed several times, where the AI knows what type of word is supposed to be in a particular location, but it doesn't know which word it's supposed to be. And so, north can be replaced by any other direction because that's its best guess. I originally wanted to try it both as multiple lines and as a single line, but since I couldn't automate the process, it would have taken too long to do it twice. And I cycled the languages in alphabetical order, starting from English, just because that was the easiest. This one, I'm not sure how it happened, but East Wind became King of Kings in the third line, which shortly afterwards became King and Queen, and stayed that way for most of the rest of the relay. And you can see the directions of the wind continue to change every so often. And finally, the North and the Sun became the North and the South. Car briefly became Canoe and then changed back. Flipping back and forth between two options is something else that happened fairly often. And then the King was blown away by the currently south wind. You'll notice the second line has been cut down to just the word why, so that's an example of a passage being completely whittled down. But later on, the random drift will add more words to that line. Later in the relay, the changes seemed to come in fits and starts. Fishermen became masqueraders, which became masks, and nets became tools. Then in quick succession, we have the tools were masked, devices were obscured, devices have been blurred, tools are dark, tools are black, equipment is blue, blue vessels, blue pots, all one right after the other. So sometimes there's a stable equilibrium and then something upsets that equilibrium and it rapidly shifts to something completely different. Here, why changes to what was the reason, expanding the second line again. This was one of the strangest ones. Somehow spring became the 1990s, and 1990s being a number stayed that way almost until the end. You'll notice that the passage is getting shorter, but that also the changes seem to be getting slower, with fewer words and simpler sentences, not as much as able to change even with imperfect translations. Also, what was the reason became what happened, and then what was the result. Result expanded again to what happened to the scene. And then at the very end, in the second to last step, we finally lose the 1990s and it becomes the 9th century. And this is the final result of the relay. By the 9th century, tensions between North and South had worsened. What happened here? The king and queen fight, and the queen puts out the fire, but the matter is not resolved. It's like cold water. It's very difficult.